Welcome to this encore edition of St. Louis on the Air from St. Louis Public Radio. I'm Kate Grumke in for Elaine Cha. One of the biggest ecological disasters in the world is happening in our own backyards. Prairies are an essential ecosystem that filters water, stores carbon, and supports some of the most iconic American animals and plants. But they're disappearing faster than the Amazon rainforest, and they're almost entirely wiped out of Missouri and Illinois. Joining me to talk about this are the authors of the new book, Sea of Grass: The Conquest, Ruin, and Redemption of Nature on the American Prairie. Dave Hogge is an environmental journalist based in St. Paul. Dave, welcome to St. Louis on the Air.
Hey, thanks, Kate. Really glad to be here.
And Josephine Marcotti is also an environmental journalist based in Minneapolis. Josephine, thank you for being here.
Happy to be here.
So I'm curious what drew both of you to wanting to write a book about the prairies. Let's start with you, Josephine.
I was for many years the environmental reporter at the Star Tribune. And in Minnesota, you really can't write about the environment without also writing about the prairie and agriculture. So those issues in the book were issues that I had written about for many years at the newspaper. And when we got done there, Dave and I both retired around the same time. We put together a proposal and decided to write a book about it that was for a national audience, because it's not just a Minnesota problem, it's a national problem.
And Dave, what about you? What was appealing about this project?
Yeah, well, when Josephine and I were working together at the newspaper, she came across these two amazing data sets. They were independent, but they were parallel. They showed that we are now plowing up the western tallgrass prairie, our continent's remaining prairies. We're plowing them up at the rate of 1 million acres a year. That's about as fast as the Amazon rainforest. It's an ecological disaster, but nobody's paying attention because it's out in very remote places in South Dakota and Montana and Nebraska. Josephine turned it into a terrific series, The Vanishing Prairie. We had a great response from readers, and as Josephine said, we turned it into a book. And the thing is, I think many of us Midwesterners, we take the prairie for granted. My parents both grew up in small towns in western Minnesota on the edge of the prairie. Many of us Midwesterners think, oh, it's that flat, boring part before you get to the mountains. And what we discovered working on the book, and what many scientists and ecologists have discovered in the last couple of decades, is that in fact the prairie is an incredibly rich ecosystem and an invaluable ecosystem in terms of the health of our planet.
And I think that we should probably start with a definition. So, Josephine, help us understand what a prairie is.
A prairie is a savanna. It's a grassland, a place that has decent soil, but is usually very dry, too dry for trees to grow. So that's where you find only grasses. So you have the grasslands in the South America, the grasslands in Africa, and also in Russia. But the grasslands we have here in the United States are among some of the largest in the world.
And could you give us a bit of a geography lesson, Dave? What are the different types of North American prairies, and where are they found?
Sure. Roughly speaking, the prairie stretches from eastern Illinois to the Rocky Mountains. On the east, it was the tallgrass prairie, Illinois, Iowa, places where they get a little more rainfall because it's farther east, and grasses used to grow over our heads, 6-7 feet high, so tall that the frontier settlers had to climb on the back of their horses to see over the grass and see where they were going. Then in the center of the country, places about like St. Louis, eastern Kansas, western Minnesota, it's the mixed grass prairie. There's a little less rain there, and so you get a different set of grass and flower varieties. And if you go farther west in the rain shadow of the Rocky Mountains, places like Wyoming and Montana, that's the short grass prairie. And because they're in the shadow of the Rocky Mountains, they get very little rain, 8 or 9, 10 inches of rain a year, precipitation a year. And the grass only grows maybe ankle high or shin high. It's a whole different set of varieties of grasses that can survive that very, very dry, hostile climate. And that's where we still have remaining grasslands in North America. About 40% of the original shortgrass prairie, the original western shortgrass prairie, still exists.
And we have listeners in both Missouri and Illinois. Both of these states historically had lots of prairie and now have almost none. And I'm wondering what prairie looked like here before Europeans arrived.
And so when the European settlers first came through here, they came from forested eastern forests in the United States and also a much more manicured countryside in Europe. So when they encountered the grasslands here, they were astounded and often terrified just by the sheer openness of it and the sheer wilderness of it. But they had to bring their families and their wagons and their horses through, and often they didn't know where they were going and they couldn't see where they were going. It's hard to imagine a place that doesn't exist anymore, but those grasses were towering, and they had to sometimes stand on the backs of their horses just to see where they were going. And it was also full of wetlands that would come and go depending on the amount of rainfall that they were getting. And they used to fear the wetlands more than anything because they knew they were the source of diseases from the mosquitoes. They didn't know it was from mosquitoes. They just knew it was from those wetlands. So it was a very wild and mysterious place for them. And it took them a long time to realize what fertile soil it was.
Yeah, you all include this quote from Charles Dickens in southern Illinois in 1842 on a steamboat journey. Just going to read part of it. He calls it a dismal swamp teeming then with rank, unwholesome vegetation. So was that kind of a common reaction to this landscape around this area?
I think so. I mean, the books that we've read, the history books, are full of those descriptions. I mean, sometimes you encounter the people who sort of recognize sort of the wonder of a wetland and the prairie, and we have some of those descriptions as well in the book. But it was. That's why we named the book Sea of Grass, was because the only way that the early European settlers could describe it was to describe it as an ocean with the waves and the hills moving in the wind.
And so that's historically what it was like. Dave, what is the current state of prairie in North America?
Yeah, if you consider the tallgrass prairie region, again, Illinois, eastern Iowa, parts of Wisconsin and Minnesota, the prairie's gone. 99% of the original tallgrass prairie is gone. And as anyone who drives through the Midwest knows, it's not a sea of grass, it's a sea of corn and soybeans. And these are beautiful, tidy, highly productive farms, unbelievably rich soil, unbelievably productive agriculture. But essentially, we have taken what was a beautiful, beautiful wilderness of grasses and flowers, and we've turned it into a factory for food. It is industrial production of food. As you move a little bit farther west, the corn starts to give way to wheat. And as you move farther west, it's still mostly grasslands because until very recently, farmers thought it was too dry and too hostile to grow crops. It stayed in grass and it was cattle country. But gradually that's now also starting to change as the plows move west.
And so we've lost a lot of beautiful landscape, but prairies are also very ecologically important. Can you tell us a little bit about that, Josephine? What role do prairies play in our environment?
Well, you've probably heard about the loss of birds. There was a recent bird report that came out that said we've lost huge numbers of birds, but most of the most severe losses have been from birds that nest in the prairies, particularly in the prairies in the Dakotas, in what they call the pothole region, because those are ground nesting birds that use water and wetland areas for their nesting, and then they migrate through the rest of the country and the rest of the world. So that's why they call North Dakota the duck factory, because that's where all our ducks come from. But without grasslands, there are fewer nesting areas for birds. But more importantly, we've lost enormous numbers of insects because the insects cannot survive in areas without diverse ecosystems and grasslands. And of course, it's the birds that eat the insects. I mean, what you see is kind of the crumbling of a food system from insects to birds on up. But in addition to that, we've lost, of course, some of the big mammals like wolves and bison. Those have also disappeared with the advent of settlement of the country.
And this loss of
Okay,
prairie
just
is also important for our climate, right? Dave, could you tell us why prairie plants are so good at sequestering carbon?
yeah, exactly. You think about grasses and flowers. What do? They inhale carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and they exhale oxygen. It's the process, photosynthesis, by which plants grow. Well, these prairie grasses have been doing that process for thousands and thousands of years, and they've been sequestering carbon for thousands and thousands of years. It's estimated now that the world's grassland soils hold more carbon than human beings have released into the air since the Industrial Revolution. The soils hold more carbon than our forests do on the planet, more carbon than the atmosphere holds. And Midwestern gardeners know this. If you sink your shovel into your garden in the backyard, that Midwestern soil comes up rich and inky black. It's just black. Well, why is it black? That's carbon that prairie plants have been taking out of the atmosphere and sequestering in the soil for many, many centuries. And every time we plow it open, every acre of that we plow open, we're releasing carbon into the atmosphere and we're making climate change worse.
And I was also interested in learning about the ways that these ecosystems have evolved, especially the iconic species like the bison, how they've evolved with the ecosystem. So, Josephine, could you tell us a little bit about why those humongous animals are so important to the prairie ecosystem?
Well, they've been around for I don't know how many tens of millions of years, like so many of our animals, but they evolved with the prairie and they became a keystone species for the prairie, which means that they influence the ecosystem and the ecosystems of other animals in significant ways. So, for example, one of the things that you'll often see bison doing if you ever go out west is you'll find them rolling in the dust, right? They make these big clouds and they come up and they shake all the dust off. And they leave a little wallow in the ground. And that wallow becomes kind of a mini wetland. So when it rains, it holds water. That's where frogs grow. That's where certain species of birds and plants, you will always find specific species around those wetlands. Bison also, they are a disturbance for grass, which grass needs, like it needs to be burned or it needs to be grazed in order to stay healthy. And of course, they graze a lot and then they move on. And then behind them, they leave short grass, which creates a space for certain kinds of birds and certain kinds of species. And that's how they spread seed across the prairie as well. I mean, they are a true iconic species.
Kate, just one little example of the exquisite adaptation that bison and grass have together. Scientists now believe that there's a chemical in the saliva of bison so that when they graze the grass, crop it short, that saliva actually stimulates new grass growth. They also believe there are certain species of prairie grasses where the seeds are so hard and so protective against prairie drought, prairie winters, that those seeds can only germinate after they've passed through the digestive system of a buffalo. So that's just how these two species, grass and bison, have evolved together over thousands of years. They need each other and they help each other.
That's fascinating. We need to take a quick break, but we'll be back shortly to continue this conversation. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio. Welcome back to this encore edition of St. Louis on the Air. I'm Kate Grubke. Now back to our conversation with Dave Hagi and Josephine Marcotti, co-authors of the new book Sea of Grass, The Conquest, Ruin, and Redemption of Nature on the American Prairie. This is a book about prairies, but it also contains a really great chronicle of American agriculture's development. Josephine, why did this prairie book need to spend so much time on agriculture?
Well, for agriculture is very important to this country, first of all, and it was also very important to the settlement of this country. But it is through agriculture that we have completely redesigned and replumbed the center part of the United States, and it is also nowadays the source of enormous amounts of pollution and loss of species because of agriculture. And we felt that putting together a story that connects the past with the present and the problems we have now, like the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, which comes from the use of fertilizer in the Midwest, the contamination of drinking water across the Midwest, that also comes from agriculture, that these are important things that people need to know in context. But we also wanted to write about what possible solutions there are for changing how we manage the land and how we manage agriculture to give people an idea of how it could be different.
And some of how you walk through this is through these inventions that really transformed agriculture. And one caught my eye because it's a story from Illinois. It's about a famous Illinois blacksmith who had a huge impact on agriculture and with it the prairie. So Dave, how did John Deere change the ecosystem?
Well, when the New England pioneers got to states like Ohio and Indiana and Illinois, it didn't take them long to discover that this was incredibly rich soil. Those grasses had been loading and locking away nutrients for thousands of years. The problem was that, as Midwestern gardeners know, that soil is thick and black and moist. When they arrived on the edge of the prairie, they brought their farm implements from New England and Pennsylvania. They were cast iron plows. They'd worked very well in the sort of gravelly, sandy soil of the East Coast, but those cast iron plows just couldn't handle this moist black soil of the prairie. That muddy soil would stick to the plowshare, the blade of the plow. The poor farmer would have to stop every 20 or 30 feet plowing a furrow, take a stick and scrape that muddy soil off the plow. And it was hugely frustrating. So by a little bit of luck and a little bit of ingenuity, this young, striving blacksmith, John Deere, recognized that maybe polished steel would be a better material for those plows. And almost by accident, he took a discarded saw blade from a sawmill where he'd been hired to repair the machinery. He hammered it into the shape of a plowshare, attached it to the front of a plow. And it was a big hit because that polished steel, it held a sharp edge that could cut the prairie grass roots. And it was so smooth that it shed that soil as you moved down the furrow. And in his first year, they started to catch on. He sold 10 or 20 of those plows. A few years later, he was selling 1,000 plows a year. Before long, he was selling 10,000 plows a year. And now, of course, John Deere is the biggest implement company in the world. And because of that plow, there were other machines going on at the same time, harvesting machines, harrowing machines, and so on. But because of technological breakthroughs like that, frontier farmers pretty much transformed 1/6 of a continent, hundreds of thousands of acres in just 30 or 40 years because of these amazing inventions of new farm implements.
And Josephine, another important invention that you all wrote about that left a huge mark on the prairie was tile drainage. What is that, and what did it do to the Midwest?
Oh, it's funny. When I was a reporter at the Star Tribune in Minneapolis, I used to despair about the fact that I would have to sometimes write about ditch law and ditches and worry so much about how it would be just incredibly boring for readers. But tile drainage is, in fact, the thing that made much of our agriculture and much of our agricultural productivity possible. Because as rich as the prairie soils were, the wetland soils were even richer because there was even more carbon stored in there, even more nutrients stored in there from so many decades and decades of building up accumulated dead wetland plants. So when they figured out how to drain them, then all of a sudden that land was worth twice the price of land elsewhere. And it became like almost a national mission to drain the prairies and drain the wetlands and make that land productive. And today, we don't even know what we're missing because there's so many wetlands are gone. And you can't see the way that the land has been replumbed because all of those drainage pipes, they called tile drainage, is underneath the ground by 3-4 feet, and they all lead into ditches, and from ditches into rivers, and from rivers into the Mississippi River, and from the Mississippi into the Gulf of Mexico. So it's an entire replumbing of a country that most people aren't even aware of.
And eventually, these systems led to one of the most dramatic environmental disasters in American history, the Dust Bowl. Dave, what did that have to do with the loss of prairie?
Well, sure. When the frontier farmers reached the region of Kansas, Oklahoma, Nebraska, around the middle of the 19th century, late in the 19th century, they knew it was more dry than the eastern grasslands, than the eastern prairie states like Ohio and Illinois, but they still thought it would be a good place to farm. And as it happened, the 1920s, when there was a big immigration surge into Kansas, Kansas's population doubled in about 15 years. The 1920s happened to be a very wet decade, and farmers plowed up thousands of acres of Kansas to plant wheat. We were right after World War I, which had decimated the world's wheat supply. Wheat prices were high. The American federal government was subsidizing wheat prices. And those Kansas farmers thought this is great. And there was a myth at the time that the plows bring rain. Where you plow open the grassland, rain will follow. Well, it turns out that was wrong, because the next decade, the 1930s, was the worst drought in recorded American history. And all of a sudden, you had thousands and thousands of acres where the grasses had been plowed up. There were no longer roots to hold the soil in place. There was no longer cover to protect the soil from the baking sun. And so for months a year, roughly from the fall harvest until the spring, you had bare, exposed soil with no roots, no plants to hold it in place. When these giant windstorms blew out of the west and the north, it just blew that soil away. You've probably seen pictures of the Dust Bowl where an entire barn is half buried by sand. Cows would go blind in these dust storms. Their eyes would tear up, and the sand would form sort of a cement with their tears and glue their eyes shut. Thousands of animals perished in these dust storms. And by the time the Dust Bowl was over at the end of the 1930s, fully 1/4 of the population of that region of America had just abandoned it, had just abandoned the farms. You know, you've heard the story, John Steinbeck and Woody Guthrie, the Okies. It was a colossal catastrophe, and people just up and left.
And Josephine, are there modern comparisons to that kind of erosion or the dust storms that we saw at that time?
You know, Dave and I went to Chicago for a meeting earlier this summer, and it was supposed to be just a, flight in the morning and flight out in the evening. But we hit a storm on our way out, and it was a dust storm similar to the kind that people used to see in the 30s. It was so severe that it shut down O'Hare Airport for several hours, and you could see this dark brown cloud rising up in the west. I mean, that was all the soil from Iowa. So, and there was similar storms like that in South Dakota where people were stranded on the highways until that storm passed. So, erosion and the loss of soil from our fields is still an ongoing problem, even though we know how to fix those things.
And another key invention that fueled the farming takeover of the Midwest was the rise of fertilizer. Dave, why is modern farming so reliant on fertilizer?
Well, for a couple of reasons. One is that we have exhausted the native fertility of these soils. Intensive agriculture between, let's say, 1880 and 1940, we think of soil as a renewable resource. We think of food as a renewable resource, but soil is not a renewable resource. That rich black topsoil that farmers discovered That took thousands of years for nature to create that through cycles of growth and decay. And once you start to sap the nitrogen, the phosphorus, the other organic material out of that soil, it gradually becomes less and less fertile. They estimate that the soils in Indiana, Illinois, have lost 40% of their native fertility. They call it mining nitrogen. It's an extractive industry, planting corn and soybeans over and over again. It extracts the nutrients. And so by the 1940s, farmers recognized that their yields were going down, their soil was less fertile, and by an amazing historical coincidence, that's about the time that artificial nitrogen, synthetic nitrogen, arrived on the scene. Josephine has a magnificent chapter in the book about the invention of synthetic nitrogen. But it changed agriculture, and it went to the point where, roughly after World War II, American farmers bought almost no synthetic nitrogen to fertilize their fields. Today, they spend billions of dollars a year on synthetic nitrogen to replace that lost fertility from the native soils.
And in the book, you all write about how that has led to a huge increase in yields. This has been a positive thing that we're able to produce more food. But one of the downsides is for water. And in 31 states that make up the Mississippi River Basin, you write that about half of all the land is devoted to row crops like corn and soybeans. So, Josephine, why is that fertilizer a problem for the river?
Nitrogen is what they call a slippery nutrient, a slippery compound. No matter how hard you try to make the exact amount of nitrogen available to the plants that you need, no more, no less, it still moves through the soil and then moves into the water supply. It is inherently difficult to control it. So we lose nitrogen. I mean, it comes through the soil and into the water, and there's no really way to prevent that. And it's true that farmers tend to use more nitrogen than they need, just like we often put more salt on our food than we need, because you feel like a little bit might just be a little bit better. But it is a significant problem for water, not just for water ecosystems, but also for drinking water. But at the same time, we have no way of going back, because something like half the world's population is only alive today because of the nitrogen fertilizer and the food it helps us produce, far more than the world could produce on its own without synthetic fertilizer.
Dave, is there a potential solution here with prairies that could help with these issues of erosion and with water quality?
Sure. One of the great stories we stumbled across in the course of the book is a scientist named Lisa Schulte Moore at Iowa State University, and she has been a pioneer of a concept called prairie strips or buffer strips. Let me take one step back. When you have native plants, flowers, and grasses, their roots can go 8, 10, 15 feet deep into the soil. And they capture nutrients and they capture chemicals and so on. It's just a rich sort of sponge. And the breakthrough that Lisa Schulte Moore, she's a MacArthur genius, MacArthur Fellow, the breakthrough she made, she was able to demonstrate in test farm fields in Iowa that if you could take just 10% of a farmer's field, just 10%, take it out of corn or soybeans and convert it to a prairie strip, grasses, flowers, and so on, just 10% had an outsized impact on erosion and pollution. That rather narrow prairie strip could significantly reduce soil erosion off the field. It significantly reduced the amount of chemicals that were flowing out into nearby streams. Bird and insect life came back because of the prairie grasses and flowers. So those prairie strips were just an extraordinary breakthrough. They've helped solve a political problem because their environmental benefits were so great that sort of the conservation groups got behind them. But when farmers realized that they didn't have to take out a third or a half of their field out of production, but just 10%, farmers began to realize, well, okay, maybe this is practical. Maybe I can do this. And now, if you look across the middle of the United States, there are now thousands of acres of prairie strips thanks to the research of Professor Schulte Moore.
And there are some here in Missouri and in Illinois. Josephine, I'm wondering, you all spoke with a lot of farmers in the research for this book. How did they grapple with their responsibility in this system?
Many of them see themselves as environmentalists and people who care deeply about the water. And they think that they believe that they are caretakers of the land. And we sort of came away with the understanding, and I hope we were able to express this in the book, that farmers are part of a system that we all created together. We all like cheap food. We all like, ethanol fuel. We've allowed this system to continue. So they are stuck in that system too, and many of them would like to be able to break away from the corporations that they rely on for seeds and who don't give them a lot of choices in the kind of seeds they buy or in the kind of products they use or in terms of the markets that they can sell their product to. I mean, they are all stuck in a system and they want to succeed in that system.
Kate, one of the really unfortunate things that's happened in Midwestern agriculture, American agriculture, in the last 50 years is that it's become a monoculture of corn and soybeans. If 50, 60 years ago, my wife grew up on a farm in southern Minnesota, 50, 60 years ago, farmers in this part of the country planted a lot of different things. They planted corn and soybeans, but they also planted barley, alfalfa, oats, flax, all sorts of things. And that was good for the soil. It was good for nature likes diversity. And what one crop takes out of the soil, another crop returns. Diverse plants that helps fight off pests and pathogens and so on. But we've built a food system now where there are farmers who want to grow oats or barley. They can't sell it. There's no market for it. We've built a food system that is built around corn and soybeans. And so that's all you see in the Midwest, and it's really bad for the planet.
We need to take a quick break, but we'll be back shortly to continue this conversation and hear about some of the possible solutions. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio. Welcome back to this encore edition of St. Louis on the Air. I'm Kate Grubke. Now back to our conversation with Dave Hagi and Josephine Marcotti, co-authors of the new book Sea of Grass, The Conquest, Ruin, and Redemption of Nature on the American Prairie. In this book, you looked at a lot of agricultural solutions to this problem, including prairie strips like we just heard about. Josephine, I'm wondering if there's another example of a solution in agriculture that you would like to highlight.
One of the chapters in the books is about insects and the broken relationship between farmers and farming and insects. Farmers have to deal with pests a lot, the bugs that eat their crops and destroy their yield. But most of the food that we eat, the melons, the vegetables, the fruit, those need pollinators. And so farmers also need pollinators in order to make their crops into food. So there's this constant balancing act between using pesticides to control the pests without also destroying the pollinators. But I'm afraid the pesticides are winning in this country because corn and soybeans don't need pollinators. They are self-pollinated or wind-pollinated. It's only the food we grow that for food that we need pollinators for. But some of the researchers at the Purdue University have been working with watermelon growers for a long time in southwest Indiana. And they have learned that if they back off of pesticide use, that the improvement in the amount of pollination they get vastly outweighs the amount of damage from pests. So if they just stand back and let nature do its thing and let the pollinators come and do their thing, that balances the damage they get from the pests, which was a really strong finding, but a hard one for farmers to adopt because they're always so afraid of losing so much crop to pests that they lose money that year. But we have found that if farmers rely more on nature and the power of nature to balance things out in their fields, that's a lot better for everyone.
And you also write about this debate that has divided conservationists known as sparing versus sharing. Dave, can you explain what those terms mean?
Sure. Briefly speaking, sparing means just leaving it as wilderness. Don't plow it, don't put animals on it, leave it as wilderness, spare the land. And sharing is the philosophy that we can have both. We can farm the land, we can put livestock on the land in a way that's not bad for the land, in a way that's consistent with clean water and wildlife and a healthy insect population. And one of the coolest examples of sharing that we found was in Montana. Now, out there, it's cattle country, and the cattle industry gets a bad reputation for a lot of reasons. But there are also these great ranchers in western South Dakota and Montana who are in love with grass, and they want to protect the grasslands. They're now working with the World Wildlife Fund and the Nature Conservancy in Montana. The Nature Conservancy has started something called a land bank. It's a 60,000 acre ranch called Matador Ranch. And the deal is that neighboring ranchers can graze their cattle at Matador Ranch for subsidized grazing fees. It's a real bargain for them, and ranchers are always looking for extra good grass for their cattle. They can graze their cattle there at subsidized rates if they make commitments to adopt conservation practices on their own land. They move the cattle around a lot. They make sure wildlife is coming back. They make sure that the bird life is healthy. And because of Matador Bank, it's this sharing principle. Nature Conservancy has changed cattle ranching practices on 300,000 or 400,000 acres in Montana. In other words, they found a way for livestock pretty well to coexist with the natural world.
And ranchers are starting to look at more than just cattle. There's some examples in your book of people raising bison. Josephine, could you tell us a little bit about how that is starting to shift?
Sure. Back in the turn of the century, there were only a few dozen bison left in Yellowstone National Park, put there by President Roosevelt and the conservationists at the time, who were trying to save the species. So over time, they became sort of a forgotten animal in most of this century. But over time, their numbers increased, and now they have become a livestock of their own. They are sort of domesticated and sort of wild for the most part, but they are a far better grazer for the grasslands than cattle. As we talked about before, they evolved and they do a much better job of taking care of the prairie than cattle do. So now bison ranching is becoming a growing thing. It's growing very slowly, but it is becoming a very popular product. And you can find bison burger in the grocery store, and you can find bison steaks at fancy restaurants. And it is just another way of sharing the land with livestock.
And I was looking for places that our listeners could go experience prairie, and it's very hard to find remnant prairie around the St. Louis region. But we do have a lot of replanted prairie, so places where people have gone into parks or local green areas, and they're trying to re-prairie maybe even an urban area. And I'm wondering what happens when prairie plants get to work on soil that has either been exhausted by farming or has been urban like that. Dave, could you tell me a little bit about how prairie plants kind of come back to a place?
Sure. Kate, one of the coolest things we saw was at Kansas State University in the, there's a big native grassland near Manhattan, Kansas. And we think of, okay, you need healthy soil to have healthy plants. Healthy soil produces healthy plants. Well, guess what? It works in reverse as well, because healthy plants help make healthy soil. The researchers at Kansas State have a series of experimental plots. This is on land that was farmed for wheat and corn for decades. The soil was just exhausted. You go look at it, it's sort of gray and powdery if you pick up a handful. And plot by plot, they started planting native prairie plants on that land, grasses, flowers, and so on. And what they found, it's kind of miraculous. After 8 or 10 years of having prairie plants back in this soil, the soil has been transformed. It's full of microbes, it's full of bacteria and fungi and healthy little critters. And you go into those test plots that have been planted in prairie plants for 8 or 10 years, and you scoop up a handful, and the soil is black and rich and moist. It has that great smell that gardeners know. So there's this amazing symbiosis. And sure enough, we are seeing more and more people recognizing this and reestablishing prairies. In the book, we write about the largest prairie restoration project in America in northern Minnesota, Glacial Ridge.
And the way you wrote about that, I really wanted to go visit it. It sounds so interesting. But Josephine, you wrote also about opposition to that. Can you tell me about what opposition typically looks like to this type of land conservation, both from individuals and from bigger organizations?
Yes. So, we have an American history that is devoted to and has been dependent on farming. Farming and the idea of the noble farmer and the idea of independent farmers who can support their family off the land is very much a part of our culture. And there is a strong belief, I think, in many rural areas that land is to support communities and is to support families and is to make money. I mean, land is an economic force. And if you take land out of production, if you take it away from farmers and say, oh, no, now this has to be wild, this has to be for birds and insects and other animals, and for the occasional use of recreation on a Saturday afternoon, people in rural areas really feel like you're taking away their economic viability and the future of their communities. There's such a strong distinction in idea between what land is for. Is land for making money? Is land for growing crops? Or is land something that we can use for what we call ecosystem services, to clean our water, to help maintain wildlife, and to give us a place to go where we don't have to grow crops? So it's a dichotomy, and I think it's one that occurs throughout many states, not just in Minnesota.
There's a really sort of happy ending at Glacial Ridge in northern Minnesota, where there was this same tension. The Nature Conservancy wanted to take a big area of farmland, turn it back to prairie. And initially there was local political opposition. They were going to take land off the tax rolls, take it out of economic production. But a nearby city, Crookston, Minnesota, it was running out of clean drinking water, and they were worried about it. Well, what's one of the things that grasslands do? Grasslands purify water. When rain falls from the sky, it goes through the plants, that rich soil goes into the aquifers, and it's clean. And so they made a deal: if you let us reconvert this land back into native prairie, you will have an unlimited supply of clean drinking water for the future of the city of Crookston.
And Josephine, after reporting on these examples, where did you personally land on this sparing versus sharing debate?
That's a good question. I think that we don't need as much corn as we have. We have a culture and an economy based on volume and high productivity. I think that we would be better off as a country if we grew food, not corn for ethanol and not corn for animal feed. I think we would be much better off if we had more diverse farming. That would require changes in our agricultural policy and changes in the Farm Bill, and also changes in cultural attitude. But I think it can be done. I think there are farmers who are doing it. There are people who are doing it now.
And because you mentioned the Farm Bill and it's up for debate again this year, what types of changes in that legislation could better conserve prairies? I'll let you continue, Josephine.
I think we could change the ethanol fuel mandate. That creates a market for corn that precludes almost everything else. It raises the price of corn because of the demand that it creates. I think that we could do a better job of providing subsidies and support for ranchers to help them grow grass for cattle. Right now, they can't compete. In places like South Dakota, grasslands are getting plowed up, by the millions of acres because farmers can make much more money growing corn than they can raising cattle or bison. Those, I think, would be two of the most important things that could be done.
Kate, sort of our view, I think our view is with the Farm Bill, every year the federal government sends billions of dollars to farmers. And many times that supports destructive activities, plowing too much land, using too much chemicals. And our thinking is, if we're going to subsidize farmers, and there's a case to be made for that, let's subsidize things that are for the public good. Let's subsidize farming practices that protect the soil, that protect wildlife, that protect clean water. And it's easy to do that if you give farmers the right incentives, and we could do that through the Farm Bill. We would have a healthy farm economy and a healthier planet.
And when we think about prairie plants coming back to landscapes, you guys also wrote that after farming, it would take about 700 years for soil to return to its original prairie state. And reading that made me feel kind of hopeless about the situation. And I'm wondering, Josephine, is that your takeaway from that fact, or what do you take from that 700 years stat?
Well, that's kind of an evolutionary perspective, one that looks at not just, the last 100 years, but the last thousands of years and what it took. I mean, if you take a patch of native prairie, that is, tens of thousands of years of evolution in one spot. So every little bit helps. There's a huge gain to be made by even a restored prairie. They're not as diverse as native prairies. The soil may not be as rich, but it's every year it gets better, and every decade it gets better after that.
And Dave, what is your feeling about that?
Yeah, I think Josephine and I came away with a certain amount of hope because as we traveled through Iowa, Illinois, Missouri, South Dakota, Montana, we found lots of people, farmers, ranchers, conservationists, who want to restore prairie, protect prairie where it exists. There are so many ingenious efforts out there. Practical Farmers of Iowa encouraging farmers to adopt conservation practices. South Dakota Grassland Coalition helping ranchers adopt conservation grazing techniques. There's so many people out there who want to do the right thing by the land, who have ingenious, creative practices to protect the soil and wildlife and water. But it's still small, and they're up against a great big agro-industrial food system that we have created as American consumers. So I'm hopeful for progress, but we have a long way to go.
And Josephine, is there a call to action that you hope people take away from this book?
Yeah, go see a prairie. We were at the Grasslands Convention, or the National Grasslands Conference in Kearney, Nebraska this year, and many of the big conservation organizations like World Wildlife Fund and the Nature Conservancy are putting together a national marketing campaign to help people understand what the prairie is and what we are losing. And I think that's a brilliant idea. When we did this book, we met so many different organizations and different people all working toward the same goal, but working alone. We always called it 1,000 points of disconnected lights. And I think that there is now an effort underway to connect those lights together into one movement, one that would engage the American public and remind them of what they have and what they stand to lose, plus influence policy in Washington.
And we're going to put together a list of some of the prairies that are nearby St. Louis on stlpr.org. Dave Hage and Josephine Marcotti, thanks for joining us today.
Oh, thank you, Kate. Really a pleasure. Our pleasure. Thank you for having us.
Their book, Sea of Grass, is available now in stores and is also at our local libraries. They joined me in August of last year.
This episode was produced by Kate Grumke.
Audio engineering and podcast design by Aaron Dorr.
Our executive producer is Alex Hoyer.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations, and leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thank you.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.